The 8th of September, 1900. The deadliest natural disaster in American history strikes Galveston, Texas. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people lose their lives. A storm surge estimated at 15 feet washes over the island city when the waters recede. Galveston is devastated. Buildings collapsed, bodies scattered across miles of debris, an entire city effectively destroyed. The official narrative tells us this was a tragedy of underestimation, of inadequate warning systems, of nature's raw power overwhelming human settlement. But what the official narrative doesn't explain is what the storm revealed beneath Galveston before the city buried it again. The photographs exist. They show something the history books prefer not to discuss. In the immediate aftermath, before the massive cleanup and reconstruction began, photographers documented streets where the hurricane had torn away upper layers of ground. And beneath the 1900 street level, beneath what should have been virgin soil on a barrier island allegedly settled only decades earlier, the cameras captured something impossible. Lower streets, older streets, complete with curbing, paving stones, and the unmistakable foundations of structures that weren't supposed to exist. The official explanation, when pressed, suggests these were simply earlier construction attempts, perhaps from Galveston's founding in the 1830s and 1840s. But that explanation collapses under the slightest examination, because the lower level wasn't slightly below the 1900 street surface. It was 8 to 12 feet down, and the construction methods visible in the exposed foundations didn't match anything allegedly available to Texas settlers in the mid-1800s. The stonework was too precise, the street paving too sophisticated, the drainage systems too advanced. Start with the timeline problem. Galveston's official history claims the city was founded in 1836 by Michel Menard and a group of investors who purchased 4,605 acres of land. The settlement grew rapidly due to its natural deep-water port, becoming Texas's largest city by 1860. A thriving commercial center built in just a few decades by enterprising settlers and immigrant labor. Standard American frontier success story, except the mathematics don't work. By 1900, Galveston had a population approaching 38,000. The city featured massive commercial buildings, ornate Victorian architecture, sophisticated port facilities, electric streetcars, telephone systems, and infrastructure that supposedly took 64 years to build from absolute nothing. But when the storm exposed the lower city, it revealed construction that would have required decades to complete, and then decades more to bury under 8 to 12 feet of sediment through natural processes. The timeline doesn't compress, it shatters. The photographs from September and October 1900 show work crews clearing debris. In the background of several images, clearly visible if you know what to look for, are exposed cross-sections of street. The upper level, the 1900 street, sits atop a distinct layer of soil and fill. Below that layer, another street surface, complete and intact. Not a construction base, not a previous grade attempt, but a finished street with curbing and drainage. And below that, in some photographs, hints of structures, basement walls, foundation stones, architectural elements that descend even further into the earth. The official cleanup operation moved with suspicious speed. Within weeks of the storm, even while bodies were still being recovered, crews were already filling in the exposed lower levels, not excavating them, not studying them, not documenting what had been revealed, filling them, burying them again. The decision was presented as practical necessity, as part of the massive grade-raising project that would eventually lift the entire city 8 to 17 feet higher. But the urgency, the deliberate covering of the lower level before adequate documentation, suggests something beyond mere civic engineering. The Galveston grade-raising project remains one of the most ambitious civil engineering undertakings in American history. Between 1902 and 1910, the city lifted more than 2,100 buildings, some weighing thousands of tons, while pumping millions of cubic yards of sand beneath them to raise the island's elevation. The official explanation presented this as protection against future hurricanes, And certainly, that was the stated purpose. But it accomplished something else equally important. It permanently buried whatever the 1900 storm had exposed, ensuring that the lower city would remain hidden beneath a new layer of officially sanctioned fill. The process worked like this. Buildings were jacked up on temporary supports, some lifted as high as 17 feet. Canal dredges pumped sand slurry from Galveston Bay into the spaces beneath and around the structures. The sand settled, dried, and formed a new ground level. Streets were repaved at the higher elevation. Everything that existed before, including whatever the hurricane had revealed, disappeared beneath the new surface. Official, documented, celebrated as engineering triumph. A perfect cover for burial on a massive scale. But here is what the engineering records don't explain. Why was the fill depth so inconsistent across the city? Why did some areas require 17 feet of raising while others needed only 8? The official answer points to varying storm surge impacts and natural topography. But the variation doesn't match storm surge patterns. It matches the depth of the lower city. The areas requiring the most fill were precisely the areas where the hurricane had exposed the deepest foundations, the most extensive lower-level construction. Contemporary accounts from workers involved in the grade-raising project, found in scattered letters and diary entries, describe discoveries that never made it into official reports. Mentions of unexpected voids beneath buildings, references to old masonry that had to be broken apart before fill could be pumped in, descriptions of drainage systems that seemed to extend far deeper than the official construction dates would allow. These weren't systematic archaeological documentation. They were casual observations from laborers who noticed things that didn't quite fit the narrative they'd been told. One account, from a dredge operator named William Hess, describes pumping sand into what should have been solid ground beneath a commercial building near the Strand. Instead of meeting resistance at the expected depth, the sand kept flowing into voids that seemed to connect to other spaces. The operation supervisor ordered continuous pumping until the voids filled. But Hess noted in a letter to his brother that the amount of sand required suggested rooms or passages beneath the building that no one had officially documented. Another worker, whose name appears only as Thomas Mem, in a surviving diary fragment, described being ordered to demolish a section of exposed wall that the hurricane had revealed at a depth of approximately 10 feet below the 1900 street level. The wall was constructed of fitted stone blocks using a technique Thomas M. didn't recognize, despite having worked construction for 15 years. The demolition order came directly from the grade-raising project supervisors, and the wall was broken apart and buried within a single day before anyone from outside the work crew could examine it. These accounts exist in fragments, scattered across historical society archives and private collections. They were never compiled, never studied as a collective body of evidence. Each remains isolated, easily dismissed as individual misunderstanding or exaggeration. But when mapped together, they describe a consistent pattern. The hurricane exposed something beneath Galveston. The grade-raising project buried it, and the workers who noticed were never encouraged to discuss what they'd seen. The barrier island's geological formation supposedly occurred relatively recently, within the last few thousand years. It is a sandbar formed by sediment deposition from the Gulf of Mexico and continental runoff. Unstable shifting, not the kind of foundation typically chosen for permanent sophisticated construction. Yet the lower city revealed by the storm showed construction designed for permanence, for long-term stability, using techniques that suggest builders who either didn't understand they were building on a sandbar or knew something about the island's stability that conventional geology doesn't acknowledge. The construction methods visible in the fragments of exposed foundation tell their own story. The stonework showed precision fitting, blocks cut and placed with minimal mortar, relying on weight and friction for stability. That is not frontier construction. That is architectural tradition found in structures around the world that official history attributes to various advanced civilizations, always conveniently far in the past, or far in distance. But here it was, beneath a Texas city allegedly built by settlers in the 1830s, visible for just a few weeks before being deliberately buried. The street paving in the lower level used materials not locally available. Analysis of the few photographic details clear enough to examine shows stone composition inconsistent with Texas geology. The nearest source for such stone would have been hundreds of miles away, requiring transportation infrastructure that allegedly didn't exist when the lower city would have been constructed. Yet there it was, exposed briefly by hurricane-force winds and surge, then covered again before comprehensive study. The drainage systems posed perhaps the most troubling question. The exposed lower streets showed sophisticated drainage with catch basins, channeling systems, and what appeared to be connections to larger underground conduits. This wasn't primitive ditch drainage. This was engineered water management designed to handle significant flow, suggesting a city built with full understanding of the island's flood vulnerability. But if Galveston's founders in the 1830s and 1840s had such advanced understanding, why does the official record show the city suffering repeated flooding throughout the late 1800s, as if each storm was an unexpected surprise? Unless the lower city wasn't built by Galveston's official founders, unless it was already there, unless what the 1836 settlers actually did was discover and inhabit existing structures, perhaps buried or partially buried already, perhaps damaged by some earlier catastrophe, and then created a foundation narrative that erased that inheritance by claiming they'd built everything themselves in just a few decades of remarkable frontier progress. The architecture supports this possibility. Galveston's surviving pre-1900 buildings, the ones that weathered the hurricane, show construction quality that seems excessive for frontier boomtown development. The Bishop's Palace, begun in 1887, features stonework and craftsmanship that official history attributes to the wealth of the family commissioning it. But when examined alongside other major Galveston buildings from the same period, a pattern emerges. They're too uniform in their sophistication, too consistent in their advanced techniques, as if built by craftsmen working from existing templates rather than pioneering new methods. The Strand District, Galveston's commercial center, was called the Wall Street of the Southwest before the 1900 storm. The buildings there, constructed throughout the 1850s through 1890s, featured cast iron facades, elaborate Victorian details, and structural engineering that shouldn't have been accessible to a frontier port city. The official explanation credits Galveston's wealth from cotton trade and shipping, but wealth doesn't automatically confer advanced architectural knowledge. It has to be imported or learned. So where did the knowledge come from? What if they didn't learn it? What if they inherited it? What if the lower city the hurricane exposed was the original, and everything above it was adaptation? Repair, rebuilding after some earlier disaster had buried the first level. The grade-raising project after 1900 would then be the second burial, the final covering of evidence that Galveston's history extended much further back than 1836, that the city sitting on top of a sandbar had existed in some form long before official records begin. This raises the mudflood question directly. The theory, dismissed by mainstream historians, but supported by architectural and geological evidence worldwide, suggests that a series of catastrophic events in the 1700s and 1800s buried the ground floors of cities across the globe beneath meters of sediment. The buried first floors became basements. The basement windows we see today at ground level were once second-story windows. Entire civilizations' worth of architecture was buried, inherited by subsequent populations who claimed it as their own construction. Galveston fits this pattern precisely. The lower city exposed by the hurricane wasn't slightly below ground. It was 8 to 12 feet down, exactly the depth that appears repeatedly in mudflood evidence from cities worldwide. The construction quality exceeded what the official founding date would allow. The materials weren't locally sourced, and the response to the exposure wasn't study or documentation. It was burial, deliberate and rapid, ensuring the evidence disappeared beneath a new official layer before too many questions could be asked. The timeline of the grade raising project itself reveals the priorities. The first buildings lifted and the first areas filled were precisely the locations where the hurricane had exposed the most dramatic evidence of the lower city. The Strand District, the commercial center where the most sophisticated foundations had been revealed, received fill first. Residential areas where less significant exposure had occurred were raised later. The pattern suggests a systematic effort to cover the most problematic evidence as quickly as possible. The photographs that survived from this period show something else interesting. In images from 1901 and 1902, during the early stages of grade raising, buildings sit at various heights, some still at original level, others already lifted, creating a chaotic cityscape of structures at wildly different elevations. But in these transition images, something becomes visible that wasn't apparent before or after. The scale relationships between buildings don't work correctly. Buildings that should appear roughly the same height show foundation depths that vary by 10 or 15 feet, unless they weren't constructed during the same period. This would explain the persistent reports throughout the late 1800s of Galveston buildings suffering from flooding that seemed to pour up from beneath, rather than in from outside. Multiple accounts describe basements that filled with water during storms. Even when the ground, level streets remained passable. The official explanation blamed high water tables and poor drainage. But what if those basements weren't actually basements? What if they were ground level rooms from the lower city already buried when the 1836 settlers arrived? The 1900 hurricane gave Galveston a chance to examine that possibility. For a few brief weeks, the lower level was exposed, accessible, photographable, and then it was buried again, this time with official approval and engineering precision that ensured it would stay buried. The grade raising project became the perfect excuse to eliminate the evidence permanently, justified as life, saving flood protection while simultaneously erasing proof that Galveston's history extended beyond its official founding date. Consider the scale of the operation. Raising an entire city 8 to 17 feet required moving millions of cubic yards of material, supporting thousands of buildings during the process, and coordinating the work across years of continuous construction. The official justification, preventing future hurricane damage, certainly had merit after 6,000 to 12,000 deaths, but cities throughout history had suffered catastrophic disasters without undertaking such dramatic reconstruction. Why did Galveston choose the most extensive, most expensive, most comprehensive solution? The evidence suggests both motivations operated simultaneously. The storm protection was real and necessary, but it also served a secondary purpose. The grade raising didn't just protect Galveston from future flooding. It protected the official history from future questioning. By permanently burying the lower city beneath documented fill, the project eliminated the possibility that anyone could dig down and discover evidence contradicting the 1836 founding narrative. And it worked. Today, Galveston sits 8 to 17 feet higher than in 1900. The seawall, completed in 1904, stretches along the Gulf side. The city celebrates its Victorian architecture, its historical significance, its role in Texas history. Tour guides explain the grade raising project as engineering triumph over natural disaster. No one mentions the lower city. No one discusses what was buried. The photographs that show exposed foundations and lower street levels remain in archives, cataloged storm damage documentation, their actual significance unexamined. But the evidence persists. The photographs are accessible. The worker accounts exist in scattered sources. The timeline problems remain unresolved, and the simple question endures. If Galveston was founded in 1836 and built rapidly over 64 years by frontier settlers, how was there a complete lower city 8 to 12 feet beneath the 1900 street level, constructed with sophisticated techniques and materials that shouldn't have been available? The mudflood theory provides one answer. Sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s, a catastrophic event buried the ground floors of cities worldwide beneath meters of sediment. Galveston, sitting on a barrier island, directly exposed to any surge or sea level event, would have been particularly vulnerable. The lower city could have been buried in days or weeks, leaving only the upper floors visible and accessible. Survivors or new arrivals would have repurposed what remained above the new ground level. Basement windows became first, floor windows. Second and third stories became entire buildings, and within a generation or two, the catastrophe that caused the burial would fade into legend or be forgotten entirely, replaced by foundation narratives that claimed everything visible had been newly built. The 1900 hurricane threatened to expose that concealment. Wind and surge, powerful enough to kill thousands, were also powerful enough to tear away the covering layers and reveal what had been hidden. For a few weeks, the evidence was visible, photographed, noted by workers and survivors. Then the decision was made to bury it again. The grade-raising project ensured the lower city would remain hidden, this time beneath documented fill that couldn't be questioned. The pattern repeats worldwide. San Francisco buried its lower level after the 1906 earthquake and fire. Seattle regraded its downtown, burying original storefronts that now serve as the Seattle Underground. Chicago rebuilt after its 1871 fire by raising street levels. Each city offers official explanations about flood control and modern planning. Each city also has photographs showing exposed lower levels that suggest previous occupation that doesn't fit the official timelines. Galveston's contribution to this pattern is particularly valuable because the grade-raising project was so thoroughly documented. Engineering records exist showing exactly how much fill was used, exactly which buildings were raised, exactly when each phase was completed. What the records don't show is what was found beneath those buildings during the process. What structures were discovered and demolished without official documentation? What evidence of previous occupation was buried beneath the new official layer? The workers' accounts, fragmentary as they are, hint at systematic discoveries throughout the grade-raising project. Unexpected voids, strange masonry, drainage systems extending deeper than expected. Each discovery was dealt with immediately, usually by filling with sand and continuing the work. None triggered archaeological investigation. The project moved forward on schedule, burying everything beneath it. The question that remains is what else lies beneath Galveston? The grade-raising project covered the areas exposed by the 1900 hurricane, but the lower city presumably extended across the entire island. Beneath the modern streets, beneath the fill pumped in between 1902 and 1910, an entire civilization's worth of construction might still exist. Streets, buildings, infrastructure, all preserved beneath the sediment that first buried it and the fill that buried it again. No one has permission to excavate. No one receives funding to investigate. Official Galveston history begins in 1836, and no evidence contradicting that narrative is welcome. The photographs from 1900 remain in archives, their significance unexplored. The worker accounts remain scattered and uncompiled. And the lower city remains buried, hidden beneath a century of deliberate covering and official silence. But the evidence exists. The hurricane revealed it. The photographs preserved it. And the questions it raises can't be answered by simply repeating the official narrative. What was Galveston before 1836? Who built the lower city? What catastrophe buried it? And why, when the 1900 storm gave us a chance to find out? Did we choose to bury it again instead of investigating? The answers lie beneath 8 to 17 feet of fill, beneath a seawall and a modern city, beneath a century of accepted history. The evidence waits, preserved in the sediment, protected by official disinterest, and the enormous expense that excavation would require. Someday, perhaps, Galveston will dig. Until then, the photographs remind us that for a few brief weeks in 1900, the truth was visible, and then we buried it twice.